To the July 13th, 2017 session of Prescott Planning and Zoning Commission. We're going to get right started right in. I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes of our last meeting.
I so move. Second.
Okay, a motion is second. Any discussion? No? Okay, all those in favor, raise your right hand. Say aye.
Aye.
Okay. All right, regular action item. SI 17004, Hillside Apartments for a 10-unit complex. George?
Thank you, sir. This is a request for a site plan approval, and I apologize. The aerial photo is going to be a little hard to look at. I can't get it to come in any clearer than that. The property is located on Hillside, and the request is for a site plan for a small apartment complex. It's a 10-unit apartment complex. This is one of those site plans that's coming through this process for your review in order to go to council for a water service agreement. As we've told you before, that process is intended to let you look at and go through and make recommendations as to the viability of a particular project before it goes to council for the actual water.
Point of clarity.
Sir?
I know the agenda references this as 310 Hillside when in fact it's 311.
I'll verify that. Thank you. So the property in the area, in fact, the entire neighborhood is zoned multifamily medium, which allows for multifamily developments, allows for apartment complexes, duplex, triplex, and you'll see from here, all of those properties that have multiple address numbers on them have multiple units in them. So it's a neighborhood full of already existing developments similar to this. Just a little bit on that one. So the proposal is a site plan. It's a very standard design. It's a rectangular lot. The proposal is a rectangular building, 10 residential units, 1 bedroom each. Parking required is 1 per bedroom plus a half a space per unit, which adds up to a total of 15. They are indicating 15 parking spaces. All of those 15 spaces seem to be accessible. We looked at whether or not vehicles could get in and out of them, and that's been confirmed. You'll notice in the middle of the drive, so the primary access or the only access will be from Hillside. This dotted line area here represents the fire department turnaround. Generally on a site, if the fire department pulls in, they want to be able to get out without backing into the street. This is a hammerhead design that allows them to do that. Parking spaces are outside of that area, which makes it work for them. The building is a 2-story building. It does meet all of the building setback requirements for this zoning district. I will point out that while the entrance is off of Hillside and the address is off of Hillside, typical of our zoning code, the narrower street frontage, which is the one along First Street, actually counts for their front building setback. And that's indicated in here with the landscaping, a few parking spaces in their dumpster location. That would make this the rear, which it complies with, again, the 20-foot setback. This is a side, and this is a corner side. So as far as staff review of the proposal, it meets all of our minimum requirements. It is pretty straightforward. If you have particular questions about it, I can attempt to answer those from the city side. We do have a representative here from the developer.
Okay. Terry?
George, we know there's only 15 parking spaces and 10 units. We know that there are always 2 cars to every family today. Is there allowed off-street parking on Hillside and over First Street?
There's no parking on Hillside, but there is parking on First Street. So there could be additional parking on First Street if someone wanted to park on the street. I will point out, because these are 1-bedroom units, we are actually expecting a much lower car count than you would with a typical apartment unit that has 2 bedrooms. If they have met our minimum requirements, we can't require the additional parking, we can recommend it.
And so we're assuming then that the 1-bedroom, 1 bed will be only 1 person sleeping in that bed.
Or at least 1 vehicle.
Why is there no parking on Hillside? Is it
The
been-
volume, I think it's because of the volume and the speed of the
It's
traffic.
too narrow?
It's actually pretty wide, but
Is it
I
signed?
believe
Is
I
it
believe
si-
it's posted, no
is it
parking
posted?
in places. I'm not sure if it is on this block, but it is on most of Hillside.
Yeah, but it's important though, I think, because if these dens had been bedrooms, how would that have affected the parking requirement?
We would have added one additional parking space for each of the dens in the requirement.
So I would think the parking along Hillside might be critical. I sure wish I knew
Not gonna happen.
if it was posted or not.
But that's a major collector.
Yeah, I don't think that's gonna happen.
Yeah,
It's a big collector.
but that doesn't mean you can't park at the curb.
In numerous trips to and from the site for prep of the site plan, there was no parking in,
Really?
for several blocks either direction on Hillside.
Huh, okay. Okay, any other questions? Listen, can we hear from the architect?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and fellow members of the commission. I did bring some...
I need a name and address, Doug.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Douglas Stroh, 1935 Rocky Dells Drive.
Okay, good, thanks.
I did bring some exterior elevations. I don't think any of you have seen those. And pass those out right now.
Is the site pretty flat? We don't have a topo.
No. The site slopes from west to east.
Okay,
And so we step down every 2 units,
I see. Okay,
basically. You'll see that in the elevations.
all right. Oh, good, okay.
So it's a pretty standard, straightforward design, stucco and horizontal siding. I think it's a nice fit for the neighborhood.
Well, I like the fact that you've thrown in an extra stairway so you wouldn't have a long balcony running down the length of the building. I like that.
Thank you. And the balcony, if you look at the plans, the 2 larger areas has a wider balcony that people can use on the north side, and then as well as all the units on the have a cantilever deck on the south side too. So everyone will have a nice outdoor space that way.
Okay. Now, even though those dens aren't indicated as bedrooms, do you have the proper size exit windows on them
Yes.
for bedroom?
Mm-hmm.
Because they will be used as bedroom.
I wouldn't know that.
Okay. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward.
I certainly have to say that's nice sized units, 870 feet for a one bedroom
Yes.
den is a nice sized unit.
Any commissioners, any questions of the architect?
Really, I think it's a nice project for the area. It fits in well with the other multifamily units in the general location, and it's certainly an improvement for where it is now.
I do have a question following up on Mr. Marshall's thought about parking and Mr. Mentzer's. Are there any other spots in here you could put another space or two if you had to?
I don't think so. We've got everything kind of shoehorned in right now. And because of the slope on the very west end there, you know, that area is not really available for another parking space.
Oh, that's where I was looking. Yeah.
It's just a very tight site, but I think it's being proposed to be used pretty efficiently.
Sure. It was just a thought. I love the plan. It was just a
Well, I think it's
thought.
pretty straightforward plan. I like any other project, most projects we see, I'm concerned about parking.
Sure.
And and you know, being realistic, there's going to be parking problem. That's why I was asking about parking on Hillside. But it meets all the criteria, so Although Terry, you had a question about the staff's comment here.
Was that on this one?
Yeah, it says, the criteria appears to meet land development code. Come on. It either does or doesn't.
Sometimes you have to commit, George.
Staff's evaluation found it in compliance with the land development code. How's that for clarification?
I'll make a motion.
Okay, yeah, well, anybody else in the audience like to speak? Thanks, Doug.
Thank you.
Anybody in the audience? No?
Okay.
Okay, we can go ahead and vote on this?
Move to recommend approval of site plan SI 17-004 Hillside Apartments.
Okay, I have a motion and a second.
Second?
Do I have any more discussion? No? All those in favor, raise your right hand, say aye.
Aye.
Okay. Thank you, folks. Well, I did want to comment that that our city councilman Lamerson is visiting us today. I didn't mention that. Jim? Yes.
Mr. Chairman?
Asked if anybody opposed. I opposed.
Oh, did you? I'm sorry. I thought it was unanimous. Okay. We have one opposed.
Did we correct the address on that?
He's going to look
We
into
don't
it.
know.
He's going to verify, he said.
Yeah,
Cat
all the
Moody
information
assigns
provided
you-
by the applicant was 310,
Cat Moody assigns the addresses, so we don't,
but we will verify it when it goes through the formal review process for
Okay.
building
Darla,
permit.
did you get that opposed? Okay. All right, let's move on. Item number 3 on the regular action items. RP 17002, revision of plat for Center Point East Commercial Center. George?
Sir, this is a request to revise an existing subdivision plat in a commercial area. It's actually zoned industrial light. A property owner has acquired, and I'm showing you an aerial photo, a property owner has acquired a number of the vacant properties and some of the buildings existing in this subdivision, again, commercial office subdivision. His intent, they're currently divided into units with tenant spaces in each unit. His intent is to create a condominium concept where instead of leasing tenant space, they can actually sell the tenant spaces to the tenants. Commercial condominiums follow the same rules as residential condominiums. The concept is pretty straightforward. Again, the intent is to divide those units that this particular property owner owns, but not the other units that may be owned by other property owners in the subdivision. So it will only affect those indicated on the plan where you see these lines. So these 2 buildings, these 3 buildings, these 2 buildings, and this building. The intent is to create either 3 or 5 individual tenant spaces. Again, these will be ownership schemes. Someone can purchase that space. And airspace legal description has been created for each one. I'll show you an example of that in just a moment. The process is, again, a revision of plat. You're creating more lots. These lots are inside of each building, so you're creating more lots than were there originally, which requires it goes to the city council for review and approval, and also requires it come to you for review and approval. So this is very similar to someone taking an individual residential property and dividing it up into multiple properties. The concept and the process is exactly the same review. The total number of units that will be created through this process, again, doesn't change the building footprints at all. That's something to keep in mind. So a total of 34 parcels will be created by these subdivisions, but the number of buildings and the number of pre-existing building sites will stay the same. It's simply dividing up the building for ownership rather than lease. We included, and I apologize for not identifying it as such, we included an example of a 5-unit building. The space within each of the buildings would be divided by legal description, including an airspace description, as shown in these 2. And that becomes just like a residential condominium. When someone purchases it, they're purchasing the airspace inside and not the structure itself. The structure remains a commonly owned building, just like the common areas and the building in a residential condominium are not owned by the individual owners. You own the airspace inside. So same concept, just applied to a commercial project. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
So is there an ownership or an HOA or
Yes, there
something
will
that
be.
maintains the common areas?
There will be a requirement for that, as with any subdivision plat that
Is
has
there one
common
now?
areas.
Is there one in place now?
There is. All of the parking is currently under single ownership, a common area ownership. Show you on this one. So all of the area that's actually highlighted, it's not marked with the yellow highlighting. Everything around that is common area. So that common area is all of the parking and all of the landscaping. Each individual building will have to have a separate condominium association for the owners of that building. And again, that's a requirement of both the Land Development Code and the state of Arizona's condominium rules.
But there is one in place right now.
There's already
for
one
the
in place for all that common area, including the
Now, the
parking.
buildings that aren't being divided, are those individually owned?
They are separately owned. A
The-
number
the
of other
pad-
property
the
owners
pad
own them.
is.
That's correct. So what you see, the black outlines are actually the property lines currently. Those are individual lots within the subdivision. This will simply create lots within those lots
But
of the
those-
properties belonging to this particular applicant.
But the building pads that are individually owned are not airspace.
No, they're individually owned,
They're owned to
That's
the
correct.
sky, right?
but by separate parties, so they're not
Right.
involved in this particular subdivision.
Does staff see a problem with mixing those kinds of ownership?
We've seen similar circumstances all over. Individually owning spaces within a building for functional purposes is no different than leasing spaces within a building. So we don't see any kind of conflict or confusions about who's responsible for what.
See any problem with that?
I don't see a problem with it, but could you, for the benefit of those who aren't familiar with airspace, explain that airspace concept?
So when a purchaser comes in and wants to purchase one of these units, what their legal description will be is from the inside wall of the unit across to the inside wall on the other side. They won't actually own the structure of the building. They own the airspace inside, just like in a residential condominium. You don't own the walls and you don't own the spaces between the walls. Those are common area. That's a similar concept here. In this case, it'll be a commercial use within the building rather than residential, but all of the same condominium processes work the same way. So the person buys into an association and they purchase the space within the building to occupy and use.
And that's what the airspace refers to, is
When we
within the
refer to
space.
airspace, yes, it's a legal description of the interior, not including the inside walls.
With residential condominiums, you normally have a shared parcel as opposed to individual parcels.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, I mean, any ones I know of condos, it's all shared parcel. And you own what's, like you say, inside the drywall, but it's the same parcel.
No,
You know,
no, each individual unit has its
I can show you several
own.
plats that have that, it's just a shared parcel.
Are you talking about the space within the building that's common? That's correct. The legal description of the individual ownership is only that space inside. The walls themselves, the roof structure, what's underneath of the slab is commonly owned in the building. That is correct. So in this particular case, there will be 5 owners of the structure, but each owner will own individually just the airspace within one of those units.
But are you assigning a separate parcel number then for
Absolutely.
each?
And we do the same with residential condominiums.
Okay, I hadn't seen that before.
Yeah, the county, if it's a separate ownership scheme, the county requires a
Well,
separate
yes,
parcel
not
number.
always, not,
So they're purchasing more than the airspace, they're purchasing a
share of the structure.
A share of the structure.
That's correct. Just as you would if you purchased a condominium, a residential condominium, you're
All right.
purchasing a share of the structure.
George?
Sir?
Is there any difference in fire department's requirements when you got a tenanted building up against an owner's building? And is there any
It-
requirements from insurance companies insuring that?
There is something
Fix
similar.
it When you're mixing owners with tenants?
There is something similar to that I'll talk about. In this particular case, the buildings don't touch one another. So those that are being subdivided for condominium purposes are separated from those that will remain single ownership and just lease. So there's no mix and match. A property owner of one of these units, I potentially could lease his space out. That's something that is generally controlled by the covenants and restrictions of the condominium. If that were the case, it really doesn't matter. The ownerships are different. So the building department treats those as property lines. So there is an additional requirement for fire separation above and beyond what you would have in just a tenant separation situation where it's one ownership and the tenants are just leasing spaces. Much of the fire separation requirements are based on the types of uses, and the types of uses here can vary significantly because it's an industrial district. So if they're not considered compatible under fire or building code, there are additional separation requirements that are applied at the time of the permit.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Commissioners, any further questions? Is the owner here? Yeah.
Good morning, gentlemen
Hello?
and lady. Bill Watson, 3300 North Tova Trail, Prescott.
Okay, Bill, why are we doing this? And what's enlighten us about this whole thing?
Well, the buildings are, the total building square footage is just a little under 5,000 square foot. We've had a demand for smaller units. People, subcontractors, people that want to come in and work on their, toys or whatever, are looking for a smaller space. And so that's why we're trying to accommodate them here. The original sale on these other buildings were typically somebody bought a whole building. And, but we have a need, there's a great need for the smaller spaces.
Smaller ownership.
Smaller ownership.
A smaller space ownership. Okay. Any questions, commissioners? No? Looks pretty straightforward. Staff doesn't see
Thank
any, there's no conflict here?
No, sir. It meets the requirements for the subdivision process that it's going through. It meets the minimum requirements in the Land Development Code as was originally agreed upon at the time of the first subdivision plat.
Okay.
And because these are within the building, no additional setbacks are required.
Okay. Ken, did you have a question?
No, I was just grateful that Darren DeYoung's repair shop wasn't part of this, because it would have raised his hourly rate, and it's already sky high. So, thank you.
Yeah, I've heard from Mercedes owners.
Yeah.
All right. Anybody in the audience like to speak to this? No? If not, we can act on this.
You can, sir?
All right, I'll entertain a motion.
I would make that motion to approve. I'd recommend approval of RP 17-002, a revision of plat for Center Point East Commercial Center.
Okay, I have a second.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? No? All those in favor, raise your right hand, say aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Opposed? Okay, all right. Thank you, everybody. Okay. Item, public hearing item, amendment to the Land Development Code, LDC, relating to SPC, Specially Planned Community District.
Thank you, sir.
George?
So we've talked to you previously about this, just to give you some information and let you think a bit about it. The proposal before you is to make an amendment to our Specially Planned Communities District, which is currently listed under our residential zoning districts in the city of Prescott, to allow it additional flexibility to be used in commercial or mixed-use settings. The current process sets out the SPC, which is a master planned communities district, as a residential only or residential primarily use. One of the things that staff addressed a number of years ago with the Unified Development Code Committee was the prospect of expanding this to allow for commercial master plan developments to occur at the same time. One of the things that we looked at that time was the prospect of giving more flexibility to a property owner or a developer in coming up with a master plan that wasn't already previously zoned and established, so they would have to work around the existing zoning or have to rezone the property. It is a rezoning that is part of this process. So if a property owner wants to use, whether it's a residential property or a commercial property, wants to use the SPC district, they would rezone to that district. But a condition of that rezoning is the adoption of a master plan. And the master plan allows the developer to come up with his plan for what he wants it to look like and offer that to the city for review and approval. That gives him the flexibility to start with, essentially, if you want to think of it as a blank slate rather than all of the existing underlying zoning. He can propose what he believes is most appropriate for his property, and then the city would review it, looking for things like compatibility with adjacent properties and impacts on city services or utilities. The master plan process gives the city the ability, through city council's review and approval, and through this body's review as part of that, the option to review each of those districts that are within the master plan, each of the uses as they're placed within the master plan, and determine whether or not they're appropriate and compatible. Once that's been done, the master plan then controls what uses can come in for permitting and how they come in for permitting, rather than the original underlying zoning, which applies now. So you can think of it a little bit as the city imposed zoning through its zoning process on properties. This takes that imposition of zoning away and gives them a blank slate to work with to start. Then they bring us something that they propose. It gives the developer the flexibility to have creative ideas and to apply creative concepts, where standard zoning, and whilst I spend most of my time doing zoning, I can tell you zoning is anti-creativity. The intent is to create boxes, to create squares, to create compartments, to put things in. That's what zoning does. It compartmentalizes. So you take away some ability of a property owner to be creative with their property. So this concept was reintroduced to you partially as a result of staff wanting to do it, and partially as a result of a proposal that's now in the public realm for the James Deepwell Ranch properties in the vicinity of the airport, Pioneer Parkway, and Willow Creek Road. That property has established zoning. It's very restricted, constricted zoning in that area. It's very well established as to what goes where. It doesn't necessarily take into account many of the things that a developer wants to take into account. Access, the types of uses they want to have in certain areas. This would allow that property owner to request an SPC zoning. So there is an outside pressure as well as an internal pressure to bring this to you to allow that additional flexibility. They have made a presentation to the City Council, so it's publicly known that their intention is to try to rezone to this SPC district should Council adopt the changes that we have before you today. There are two primary changes that are necessary, a couple of minor language changes, and we've identified those in the attachment we gave you in the staff report. That's to include commercial and industrial uses as being allowed within the district. The other is to specifically take this out of the residential categories in the Land Development Code. Chapter 3 of the Land Development Code is all residential. The intention is to move it into Chapter 4, which is commercial, but also allows for mixed use, including residential,
So
to make it clear.
So the SPC does exist in our code for residential?
It's been in our code since it was adopted in 2001.
And that's what we did, Hassayampa? How
Hassayampa
how
was
about
that.
Prescott Lakes? Was that,
Hassayampa was the one that has the entire area within an SPC district. In Prescott Lakes, a portion of it has an SPC zoning to allow flexibility. It's primarily in the vicinity of the club.
but currently on our code, PUD does not include commercial.
You can do a planned area development as a commercial development. It's just they're typically constrained to a single parcel. It's not something that's
see.
a larger area. That's where a plan like the Special Plan Communities District would be applied.
But it would require a very specific master plan, right?
Absolutely. Just as Hassayampa has with us now, there's a master plan that indicates what can go where. what types of uses, what types of streets, what types of landscaping requirements. What we have from the Deepwell Ranches folks is effectively a mini zoning code for just that area. It affects what uses can go where, so it identifies them clearly. That way, property owners, the city, property owners, nearby property owners have what zoning was created for, and that is a reasonable expectation of what's going to happen on properties nearby. The purpose of zoning is to give property owners a reasonable expectation of what's going to happen next door or down the street. The master plan does that. It's adopted by council. It carries the weight of zoning. What the difference is in the whole process is that it allows a blank slate creativity option for the developer, for the property owner at the beginning of the process, instead of handing them our zoning map and saying, you have to make it fit in here. That's the big difference between this and not having an SPC district on a piece of property.
Now, once they've established a specific master plan, though, how difficult is it for them to alter that plan?
It depends on the level of alteration. If it's a significant change of uses, it's going to go back through a review and approval process, including to this body and to city council. If there are minor tweaks that are involved, generally a master plan will have criteria that allows staff to do a review. Again, compatibility with nearby properties is the primary purpose of our review. We look at that, and if it's within a smaller scale, it could be approved by the city staff rather than back through a formal process.
Okay.
Again, significant deviations go back through a public process.
Phil, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just kind of thinking out loud, and my concerns I hope you can address. Typical zoning usually separates different uses as you described, but this evolution of mixed-use development really kind of contradicts that traditional separation. So this, I think, is a good idea for those types of developments that really do have a long-term cohesive master plan type of design, and I think this type of zoning is appropriate for that. My concern is that does this give the developer too much autonomy to change or evolve a plan? So I've seen master plans before that look terrific in their initial plan, and then over time, as they are in fact developed, sometimes they morph into something dramatically different. So how much does the city retain the ability to review these things and make sure that they end up close to what was originally proposed?
Because the SPC district requires a master plan that's reviewed and approved by city council, it would have specific limitations as to how much flexibility the local jurisdiction, that would be the planning division, would have. The developer can ask for anything he wants, but if it deviates from the plan significantly, it goes back through a public process. So while a master plan that's initially adopted could change significantly, it wouldn't do it without a public review by this body and by city council as part of that, and that includes allowing the public to be involved in it. Again, this is a public hearing today for that very reason. So there is some flexibility. The majority of the flexibility that a property owner or developer gains from the SPC district is at the beginning of the process, not after he's had a master plan approved. At that point, he's lost a lot of flexibility. He created what he wanted, and if it met the city council and this body met their requirements and was approved, he's pretty much limited to that. Modifications of that or a public process similar to a rezoning.
George? Well, I guess the critical question then is how do you define significant, and who gets to make that determination?
It will be written into the master plan requirement, and it will be something that's reviewed and approved as part of that.
George, could you give us kind of a hypothetical on what Phil is talking about as far as what the developer would be allowed and what he wouldn't?
I can, but if you don't mind, I'm going to use the Deepwell Ranch master plan proposal as the example. It's not really that hypothetical because we actually have had them submit something. The concept is in their case, to take an area that we have zoned as industrial and commercial and make it a mixed-use area. The master plan would have streets, large lot buildings, small lot buildings, residential apartment buildings, multi-tenanted commercial buildings, all within a particular area because of the confluence of major roadways that allows for easy access into that area. If you work straight from our current zoning, or you attempted to rezone that, we're going to delimit you to either an industrial type use or to specifically a commercial type use that excludes industrial uses. Again, one of the things that zoning does is create boxes, and only certain things are allowed in those boxes. It delimits the concept of creativity. It was invented for that very purpose because of uncontrolled mixed uses. Although traditional downtowns are mixed uses, the types of uses you find in downtown aren't really incompatible with one another. As you get away from downtown, what was happening is you would get incompatible land uses adjoining one another, and ultimately that ended up with someone coming up with the idea of zoning. That's changed over time. The traditional zoning we have in our code right now is actually considered a second tier of zoning. The initial zoning was more of the mixed use that you find in downtown. So that was the traditional zoning, and then we went to the 1950s and 60s, it was the zoning that we have today, and now it seems to be swinging back in the direction of more mixed uses where appropriate, again, generally in urban cores. Urban cores occur where major streets cross, and this area in particular has several major streets that crisscross through it. It makes sense to develop it as an urban core rather than as an industrial district, and that's what would currently happen. Hopefully that wasn't exactly on point, but close.
Yes, regarding certain types of uses, such as entertainment, bars, nightclubs, you might have an outside auditorium and bandstands, you might have fireworks. Could you have special use permits so that as a developer comes forward, then that is discussed and you can put timeframes, et cetera, on that? And then there's also the example like at the courthouse where they allow certain events to take place on the square just by going through a board of some kind through it.
So the benefit of changing the SPC district is it allows for all of that creative master planning at the beginning, but it doesn't exclude all of the other things that city codes allow you to do. You have all of those other processes still available. So if someone wanted to use a public space in this particular area, a master planned public space for concerts, and it involves access to the public street, the reason there's a special use permit downtown is often because they're closing a street, so there's something that impacts the city. That process would still be applicable in this area. So if it's a public street, they're still having to go through all of the other review and approval processes.
Let's say like one of those open space areas, a park up there, if you wanted to have the fireworks up there, and in that you want to allow camping just during that time period, would that be controlled at the beginning, or would you have to get a special permit just for that?
That would be a special permit process under the current rules that we apply anywhere else.
We can facilitate
that
kind of oversight and flexibility, whereas we're not given a carte blanche to just let that happen.
No, there is no carte blanche as part of this process. All it does is give a blank slate to start with. Once the master plan is adopted, master plan controls, just like zoning would. The idea is the developer or the property owner is the one who creates that underlying arrangement with cooperation and coordination with the city.
Okay.
George, I have 3 questions. First one is, what's the advantage to the city of this type of zoning?
Creative development concepts often are better economic engines than non-creative development concepts. This gives someone who has a great idea for an industrial or commercial or some kind of neighborhood commercial area the ability to go in and offer that up through the master plan. That's probably the biggest benefit to the city. There is
As a revenue item, you mean?
As a revenue item, allowing the creativity to come up with ideas that are zoning constrained otherwise. There is a slight downside in that the city staff has to administer the master plan as if it were a separate code within those areas. So there's some additional layer for us. That's not a big deal for planning staff. We do it already. But the creativity outweighs that as far as we're concerned.
Okay. And my second question is, what's the advantage to the developer?
And that's what I started with, the ability to start with a blank slate, to create a land use pattern, interrelationships of different land uses at his discretion, using his or his land planner's creativity to come up with what's most appropriate rather than being constrained by what we've decided as the city should be the most appropriate.
And he could take that plan, erase sections and put something else in, but he has to come back to us.
Has to come back
Once he
through
does that.
through the process. He would have to amend his master plan, and that means back to you and back to the city council and obtaining concurrence from the city council to do that. So there's not a huge amount of flexibility once the plan's been adopted. The flexibility is only at the beginning.
And if we buy in there, if I bought a building, a commercial building, or if I built a house there, what's the advantage or disadvantage, if it is, for me being there, and then he can change things later on? Is there any?
I don't know if there's a significant difference between situation now. I mean, you deal regularly with requests to rezone property. Well, that's going to affect someone who purchased next to that property and it was something different than now they want it to be. The same situation would apply here. A property owner of standard zoned property can come and ask to rezone to something different, and we look at that through our review process. Staff looks at it, this commission looks at it, city council looks at it, primarily for compatibility with the surrounding properties. That's generally what we look for. Same thing would apply within the master plan. To amend the master plan, first thing we're going to look for is that amendment compatible with what's around it? What's not being amended? What was already approved? So I think the ability of a property owner to buy with some foreknowledge of what can happen isn't going to significantly change whether it's under the master plan or under standard zoning.
Because I think that's a very important point, that sometimes we get lost and we think the city has these rules, zoning codes, but a lot of that is to protect existing owners of property nearby, adjacent property, so they know what's there. And I think that's a real important point to get out with this zoning, is that protection is still there for somebody who's going to be buying into that, investing into that project. I think that was my questions about it.
Very good.
Jerry?
George, does this in any way affect sign codes?
In this particular case, they're asking for a comprehensive sign plan for the entire area. We're reviewing that. Whether we actually recommend that or not is part of our review process. So that will be something you will get before you at some point during the review if the SBC district change occurs.
That's way up front, though, seems like.
They provided it early on, so that's actually a good thing.
So this would allow the developer to use and introduce like new kinds of urban concepts, like form-based zoning or whatever they want.
The flexibility is to the property owner, to the developer, to determine what they want to ask for. That doesn't mean that they will get it through the review and approval process, but it allows them the flexibility to ask for almost anything. But again, that review and approval process will look at compatibility, relationships to the city infrastructure, how it impacts our infrastructure. That's all part of our review.
Well, it has more of a chance of working on a brand new, fresh
Exactly.
project, our concept or area.
And that's actually what the SPC district was intended for.
Which really wouldn't work too well in a current setting, but you go out and
Retrofitting would
get
be
raw
almost
land
impossible.
and you can, to start those new concepts, you could almost do whatever you want, build a village, build, whatever. Okay, all right. I don't think I see too much of a downside in that.
No, but will you be able to come back with some example of what the upper limit of staff's discretion is? And a follow-up to
We're
Phil's.
actually going to be coming back, if this moves forward, if you make a recommendation today to move it forward to city council, we have the master plan proposal for the Deep Well Ranches. So you're going to see a live example, not a made-up example of what we're talking about in the near future, within the next few months.
Maybe I wasn't. I was talking about what the limitation of a small change that staff can make That's
That's
what you're
exactly
talking
what
about
I'm
there?
talking about. That will be part of this review and approval process that you're about to see.
The staff will be the policeman.
We are,
You are anyway.
Well,
that's
Yeah.
what
I
planning
mean,
staff
like
does.
any master plan, though, you're gonna have a board or something for that development that's gonna oversee those land uses and participate in the marking. There would be some kind of, and maybe they could turn that over at some point to where they get out of it, but I'm assuming you would have a management structure out there that's kind of functioning as the ARC and the.
That's correct.
And all of that, and, you know, not HOA necessarily, but it
Right.
could be.
Now, is this amendment being brought forth by staff?
It is, again, it's some outside pressure to do it because we
Okay.
know this master plan is coming through the process. But again, we actually introduced this to you 4 years ago, 5 years ago, 4 years ago. It is, we believe, a good change. We believe the master plan, or special plan communities district was not thoroughly thought through at the time it was stuck into only the residential. Had it been put into the commercial at the time the land development code was worded, we believe it would have been used more. The limitation on residential uses constrains it too much.
Anybody in the audience like to speak to this issue?
I had another question.
Okay. Phil?
I do have some concern about public safety in this area. In essence, this master plan is almost like a mini city. Looking at some of the marketing material for Deepwell Ranch, there was a reference to a fire station. We have a current fire station adjacent to the airport, but stretching public services out farther from our border is something that we can't statutorily require developer fees for that. But I think we can require that developer to make capital improvements, for example, like a police substation or a potential additional fire station. Am I correct in that assumption, and is that being considered?
Legally, we can, the state calls them exactions. We could require that properties be set aside for police or fire facilities in newly annexed areas or newly developed areas. The city hasn't generally done that, but in this case, the preliminary review of the information that the Deepwell Ranch's planners have given us is that they are doing that. They're showing properties that would be appropriate for police or fire facilities should we need them. Part of the review of the master plan will be done by the police and fire departments to determine whether expansion of the current facilities will be required at some stage. Generally, with an area as large as being proposed here, the development occurs over an extended period of time, generally decades, not years. At some point during that development process, triggers should be put in the master plan that would trigger the requirement for those facilities to be put in place. A development agreement is generally also part of a master plan process, and we would suggest that perhaps those triggers are in the development agreement, and at some point, either properties are donated to the city or something is used to help create the opportunity to put in a police or fire remote facility if that's necessary.
But
Again,
you
at this
could
point,
do a
we don't
taxing
know.
district, couldn't you? You could do a separate taxing district for that new development for those facilities.
Yes,
Would this also include schools
it potentially could, yes.
and sites for schools set aside?
Again,
Which
from our
means
discussions with them, they are looking at
the
setting
school
aside.
district would need to be involved at the master planning stage,
And they are.
as well as fire and police. Anybody in the audience like to add to our knowledge here? No? What action do you want us to take today?
This is a public hearing. This is an action item. You may recommend in favor of it and forward it to city council should you choose to.
In other words, recommend the staff.
Recommend the modifications as
The
shown by staff.
modifications as the staff has
Yes.
indicated.
When it gets to the city council, there will be an ordinance attached with the language changes that we just gave you on a single page. It'll be in
Okay.
an ordinance format.
Well, since I'm not getting a whole lot of public input here, I don't think it would help us to postpone and have additional public hearings at this point. Do you,
Well,
Phil?
I wish we had some public
Well, I know,
input.
I know.
This is a pretty big deal. there.
It is a big deal, but we will have a chance to deal with it again.
This is a step in what will become a big deal, and that master plan, public review and approval of the master plan is the real big deal.
Right.
Yeah. This just
And-
opens the door.
And help me, Jerry, I hate to sound obtuse on this issue, but Phil has some thoughts that, obviously, too. This doesn't change a lot. It just, instead of us determining what zoning is, we're saying the developer can accept this concept or zoning, but he can come back to us and say, let's change this thing.
He can come back and say, here's my concept. I'm starting with the SPC districts, a blank slate, there's nothing else on it.
Right.
Here's what I want to put in for a master plan. Here's what I want to develop on the site, and here are the relationships of all of those uses. Here's a map.
Yeah.
It's going to include a map.
And 2 years from now, we get a Major League Baseball team that comes to town, and they say, well, listen, we need more space for hotels. They come back and do that.
If they provide,
Initiate.
in the master plan, if they provide for places for hotels, if they provide for particular types of uses, they wouldn't come back to you for changes in the use. They may be back to you for site plan approval processes where our land development code already triggers those. They may be back to you if they want to modify the master plan
Right.
to allow
Right.
that
And
new
add a
use.
site.
Add sites. That's where I was going. So what's the disadvantage of this type of zoning? If we were to talk to other cities who have adopted this, what would we hear from them?
You have to do a very good job of making sure the master plan is complete, that it covers everything, that you don't have gray areas where there's no determinations of particular uses in areas, or there's overly flexible language in particular areas. That's the downside. But that's also why we do a public review and approval process, why all of city staff will review it, the various departments, and you will review it, and then the city council will review it. And in the midst of it, our legal department will be reviewing it as well.
Okay, thank you, George.
But if there isn't a certain amount of flexibility, it won't work.
Again, the biggest benefit of the SPC to the property owner and developer is the flexibility at the beginning of the process. You start
Okay.
with a blank slate.
But there still has to be flexibility once the master plan's established.
That's
Or it
correct.
just simply won't work, because
And our-
things change.
Our current land development code includes a lot of options for staff to review and approve things that don't come to you or don't go to the city council. It's a similar thing with a master plan.
So essentially,
Some of it would be staff-driven, and some of it would require formal approval and
cutting it right down to its simplest terms, essentially what we're recommending to the city council is that commercial be added to the existing SPC zoning.
commercial and mixed uses, mixed-use development. That's
the-
it.
That's the change. I mean, that's
That's
all
it.
we're doing, right?
Mu-
We're
much
just
of the
simply
text-
adding commercial to
Much of the text
existing.
change just makes the language, it moves the language to an appropriate section of the land development
Okay,
code.
and I think that's
But yes, you boiled
a
it
start.
down.
I think it's simply a start. We're not making any other commitments. We're simply starting the process, right?
You're just allowing someone to submit a master plan to us and start
Okay,
the
so-
process.
Don't-
commercial, because they
In
can do it now
commercial.
in residential.
That's
Yes,
correct.
We're just adding commercial, that's it. Any other questions, commissioners? Nope, no one in the audience? Okay, I'd entertain a motion if we can act on it today. I don't think there's any reason to delay it.
I'll do it. Move to recommend amendment to the Land Development Code, Article 3, Section 3.11, spatially planned communities as depicted in Attachment 1.
I would second that motion.
Okay, I have a motion and a second. Can you explain Euclidean zoning?
I shouldn't have put that in there. I knew I was going to have to explain it.
I mean, there may be people that
Tom,
don't
we
understand,
want
know what
Tom
that
to
is.
explain it.
It was going to be good, but Tom told me 3 sentences or less, so I'm not sure I can do it now.
It's an extraction of land for public use.
It's actually the creation of those boxes I was
Oh,
talking
yeah, you're
about.
right.
If you delineate on the geography what can go in this district versus that district,
Right.
that's basically what it is.
Typical historical zoning, right?
Yeah, the post-World War II version of zoning is
I knew there was a
Euclidean
reason
zoning.
I was paying attention in 8th grade.
Okay,
It comes from the town of Euclid, not ancient Greek
I
history.
see, okay. I have a motion, I have a second. Any further discussion? No? All those in favor? Say aye. Okay. Opposed? Okay.
Mr. Marshall has a chance.
Oh. Anything else, George, we
I
need to
do
know,
have-
discuss?
I do have one brief announcement.
Okay.
Katie, can you stand up, please? Some of you have met Katie. Katie is our new planner, community
Okay.
planner for the city, Katie Peterson. So you will be seeing her in front of you before long.
Okay. She's shaking already.
You guys are being intimidating today.
Katie's from LA. I think we're probably not, should be intimidated by her.
Well, that's true. She's dealt with LA planning. I have.
That's
All
all I
right.
have, sir.
Anything else?
No,
We're
sir.
adjourned.